Guys, I said I didn't want to live in a void. Alright guys, welcome to the new set. I hope you like it, and to celebrate it, I want to start with one of my favorite videos from the past, and that is the internet ruining society? So why do I like this subject? Well, it's kind of simple, because it's very prolific in society, and it seems to come up a lot in my life, and I might talk about that a little bit further into the video. The original video that I made was right after January 6th, so, believe it or not, one of my favorite videos, even though it was a very tense time when I created that video. And a lot has changed since then, but we do have some of the same struggles, and I just want to elaborate on a lot of those struggles that we have today and now. So the first one of those is the loss of the third place. Now, I did not create this idea. This comes from the internet. Not even really sure where it came from, but the idea of a third place basically means that, we have work where we go to do our jobs, and then we go home where we also socialize and talk with our family. But then there also used to be a third place, and that place could be anything for different people. A lot of times it was a tavern, a place to go and drink, but more importantly, it was a third place for you to socialize. Now, with urbanization and urban sprawl, we've unfortunately began to lose that third place. And there's a channel called Not Just Bikes, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend you look at it. It talks a lot about the downfalls and drawbacks to what we have today, the urban sprawl, where everybody is car dependent, and we live a long way from where we work, which makes the third place really not much of a thing that can exist anymore, because a good portion of people in any one group would have to drive a decent distance just to get there. Now, the internet makes this problem worse, because before the internet was considered a means of socialization, basically people would find a way to get to this third place because it was the only place they had to hang out with their friends. Because the internet does exist today, and there are applications such as Twitter that make socializing, or I should say socializing, easier, we tend to just default to the internet. Now, I do want to start this video with a premise that basically the internet's not going away. And in my last video, I think the conclusion that I came to was more or less that we need some public education on how to communicate on the internet. And I actually want to go a little bit further into that as well. But my conclusion in this video will be slightly different. And that's because I am starting to believe that the internet is a poor influence, in the least, on society, and could even potentially be destroying us slowly. However, I do not think it's going anywhere. This is one of those things that once you give it, you cannot take it away. People would not put up with it, and the consequences of trying to do such a thing would likely be larger than any consequence that's going to come from it, but who am I to say, right? So with the loss of the third place, and that comes from urban sprawl and zoning laws, where basically you have just huge swaths of land that are just completely taken up by houses, and everyone that live in those houses, they are far away from any kind of thing that could potentially be a third place. And a third place could be a bar, it could be a bookstore, right? And we do still have some of it in our society. But another deficit we have when it comes to socialization is actually family. And that's because younger people, my generation, we are more lonely than we used to be. So, I fall into this camp, right? I live alone. And for me, work is really the only socialization that I can get. That I go into work, those are the people I talk to. I got no third place. So basically, I talk to people at work, and then I talk to people on the internet. And I want to talk about, why is this problematic? The simple answer to why this is problematic is because when you're on the internet, you feel like you're socializing, but you're not really socializing. And that hurts you in one of two ways, and probably both in a lot of cases. The first is that many of us, are human. I'd argue that it's even possible that all of us are human. And most humans have social needs. And I know that seems kind of strange because, you need to eat food to have energy to survive. You need shelter to stay, at a good temperature and whatnot to survive. You need water to survive. But why do you need socialization to survive? Why can't you go a few years without talking to anyone? Well, you technically can, but you're going to start to go kind of crazy for the most part. And again, everyone's different here. So maybe you could get through it just fine. I can't say for sure for you. But the truth is, a good swath of us needs socialization. That actually is a psychological need that we have. And if it's not fulfilled, we tend to not be in a good mood. We tend to not be very psychologically healthy. Now, the problem with the internet is when we're using it for socialization, like with social media, we tend to think that we really are socializing. It's almost as though what we've done is, we were eating a hearty meal every day, and then one day we decided to replace that with something that lacks in nutrition. So you can sort of look at it that way, that we are sort of slowly deteriorating mentally because we're not getting the socialization. And again, this is not true for everyone. Plenty of us out there, even people in my generation, get plenty of socialization and do just fine in the society we have today. The truth is, the invention of the internet and its introduction to society really has just hindered things, has made things worse when it comes to this, because we already had problems before all this too. Urban sprawl has been going on for a long time. And, those are things that affected us at that point too. That being said, look at our history. Look at people's mental health throughout these different decades. Think back to the 80s maybe, or if you don't remember the 80s, because, I know I don't remember the 80s. I wasn't alive. Think about what happened back then. We tend to think, oh, that was a simpler time, and maybe it was. But we had serial killers, we had plenty of bad things happening. So things were not perfect back then. But today we're taking a number of steps that, I'm kind of elaborating on here, that's moving us to being less socially connected. Now, the one last thing here that might be a bit controversial that I'm saying is I am basically just asserting that you're not really socializing when you're socializing on the internet. That is truly only something I can say for myself, but it seems to be true for many other people that I've observed. And, we do have studies on internet interactions, usually regarding social media and how people feel after those things. Now, the problem with all this is, psychology is a very soft science, and it's very difficult to truly understand why us humans do what we do. Now, let's get on to the second problem. The second problem is that we're not communicating effectively. And what I mean by that is we are really spinning each other off in different directions. And you can see that if you want to go on Twitter and just look at the communication going on there. And there are a lot of reasons for this. We tend to think, especially people my age that spent a lot of time on the internet when they were young, I think we tend to think, or I tend to think, that I can communicate effectively on the internet. I've been doing it my whole life, right? And that is true in many scenarios. When I'm talking to a closer friend group, people that I've already met in person and in real life, it can be fine. When we're playing video games online with people I've never met and don't know what they look like and only know their voice, really, and their skills, that seems to work just fine. But when we try to boil all this down to being more like what we have in real life, when we have platforms like Facebook, where you're required to use your real name as your account. And I think Twitter's, in a way similar there, that, you're kind of pushed to be your authentic self. Now, this can be problematic because now we're moving to a place where we're trying to emulate real life on the internet. Elon Musk is a very controversial person. I'm not going to dive into him and Twitter on this today. Maybe that's a topic for another video. But, he seems to think that Twitter will be the new town square. And, I understand where he's coming from there, and he may not be wrong that it may be the new town square. I think there was somebody out there that said it's going to be more like the Coliseum than the town square. And, we do see a lot of that, right? And that's really because we're not very effective at communicating in this format. And there's a simple reason why. We didn't evolve to communicate this way. If you ever want to understand a little bit better why humans act so irrationally, first there's a book out there that I've been reading called Predictably Irrational. I recommend it. Beyond that though, just think about how we were when we were cave people and how things worked back then. So you might wonder, why are we bad at fighter jets? Now, when I say we're bad, fighter jets do some pretty cool things these days, but the limitation is the human pilot at this point. And that's simply because when we were cave people, we didn't have a lot of need to be protected from those kind of G's. And the same kind of thing, in my opinion, is happening on the internet. That when we were cave people and we communicated, obviously we weren't speaking English here, but we would speak in person. You would see me. In fact, if you wanted to talk to me at all, you had to find me and talk to me in person. There was no other way. So we have really evolved to, communicate in person, really. And that is kind of a problem for the internet because it lacks a lot of those things. Now, the first example, I think, is probably the most pertinent one, at least in my experience. And that's tone, the tone in which you say something. So I can give you an example. Let's say I disagree with something someone has said online. And, I can't really record my voice and just put it in there because if I did, nobody pushed the play button and no one would listen. People just go past it. And I could write more to try to cover all my bases and make sure I'm not misunderstood. But I know that if I did, one, it would take me a lot longer. And two, it might maybe not be relevant, right? By the time I get that thing posted, the conversation may have moved to a different place. And that puts a little bit of a time urgency on this type of communication. And then, beyond that, we are just still dealing with text, no tone. So I'm disagreeing with somebody here. How would I do that? Let's say I was in person. I might say something like, hey, I'm a little bit skeptical of that explanation, of your explanation there. And here's why. Now that's my tone, right? And I think me taking that tone, it can be a bit difficult to become defensive. But when you read that text, you are going to have to create your own tone in your head. And the tone might sound something more like this. I'm a bit skeptical. I don't think that's right. Or, I have some concerns about that. So you can see how, even though I don't think this was too bad, it sounds a lot more accusatory. And it's up to the reader to really interpret the tone. Now, a lot of times this is done well online, or better online, by people that know each other well, because we've spoken to each other in person. We kind of know the general tones that each other tends to use, and we can kind of infer. But what if you don't know that other person that well? What if you've only met them a few times, only talked to them a few times? Or what if you've never met them, and all you have to go on is what they said and their profile picture? And honestly, as a human, I can tell you that profile picture, no matter how friendly it looks, isn't going to go that far, as far as interpreting that tone. Now, another thing is body language, right? How much do you feel like I'm accosting you in this video right now? This probably feels very laid back. But if I'm just a person on the internet, I've had a bad day, I might feel like anything I read is someone trying to hurt me. If I spent the day feeling like I've been being attacked, then I'm gonna tend to continue to think that way as I read. And I think that's true for a lot of us. So there are really big issues with tone, but another one is body language. So with body language, I can do kind of what I'm doing now. I can speak with my hands. You can see how I'm kind of flipping my palm up to try to signify that I'm presenting this to you and I'm open to your response. And I think just watching this video, you probably feel like I seem pretty friendly right now. But if you're not watching this video, if you're just listening, then you kind of have to think about this yourself. And much worse, if it's in text, then you're just going to have to picture me however you please. And really, that's not on you, right? That's just not fair to expect you to be able to do that. So there's more than just these two things when it comes to interpersonal communication. And I could really do a whole video on just the little things within a conversation that make a big difference. But I think at this point, you're probably thinking, man, Mark really hates the internet. And the truth is, guys, I really don't hate the internet. I still think it provides a lot more value than it does harm. I'm just starting to question that a little bit because it's starting to provide a lot of harm as well. And one reason I'm continuing on this topic is because, I work in a more traditional workplace, but workplaces are shifting to be more like the internet with remote work. And you know that I am an advocate for remote work. And also where I work, I was a huge champion for that type of communication. If you've heard of the program Slack, think of Discord for work. I pushed very hard to have that be implemented where I work. And, today, I feel like I've seen in more than one instance the consequences of this type of communication. Now, yeah, I guess that's kind of deserved, right? This is something that I argued for, and I do deserve to be the one that experiences the drawbacks, the blowback from it. And, what I'm seeing here is that at a workplace, you really cannot allow your workplace to become the internet when it comes to communication, especially if you think of it as the internet today, where I have some words. I'm trying to think of a way I can say this without cursing, but it's a cluster F. It really is. The internet today, a lot of it is just very, very bad communication. And people just get into shouting matches and end up hating each other, and it divides people. So you really cannot have a workplace end up like that, right? Things will fall apart pretty quickly. And the best way to deal with this in the workplace that I have found is when something goes sideways in a conversation that is pretty much an online conversation, let's be honest, it's really not much different, is that you need to revert to the old methods. You need to stop with that communication, and you need to engage the person that you're seeing is starting to have an issue with something you're saying. You need to talk about it, because when you do that, you're likely going to find the differences in context that are there that you didn't realize. And if you're wondering, why is this not a problem with email? I'd actually surmise that it is a problem with email. And email came about in a time where we had a lot harder time communicating these types of problems. But I have no doubt when email was introduced to workplaces, there were people that were not great at using it. And I say that because today there are people that are not great at using it. And I don't know if I'm great at using it. But I have no doubt that there are people's careers that have been irreparably damaged by email. And I bet a lot of those people, it happened when email first came out. But email does have an advantage to the more social media type things that we communicate with today. And that is that we tend to take more time to write an email. They tend to be longer. We tend to be more incentivized to, provide context for what we're saying and mention things that we feel people may interpret our speech or our email to say. That we feel open to take that space that we have in the email, it can be as long as we want it to be, and say, hey, just so you know, I don't mean this in an offensive way, or I don't mean any insult to this team. You have time to really write it, sit down and write it. Now, that being said, email is very inefficient. It's very slow, and we can also relate email to traditional mail, which comes down to writing letters and passing them along before we had, what we really consider to be a modern day mail system. And that is one, I'd argue, we've had for a long time in history. We've had time to adjust to the slowly written letter. Now, the problem with email is that because it's in this format, people don't read emails. And this is not just a problem today. This has been a problem since the invention of email. That if you write an email and it's more than a few sentences long, chances are 70% of your audience is only going to read 20% of it. And that's because, you're dealing, when it comes to email, with these kind of long form communications, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And as you get busy, you're not going to have time to read all that stuff, and you're going to take shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts is you read the first few sentences. If it doesn't seem like it pertains to you, you just simply go to the next email. So email, kind of falls in the middle here, where I would argue it has definitely introduced some problems that didn't exist before it. And then beyond that, it's not a very effective way of communicating, where Slack, a more social media type communication, is a lot more effective in a lot of ways. And that's because, one, you can communicate real time. You can involve whoever you want or do not in any given moment. And you can have larger conversations without getting run over in email chains with different people responding at the same time and then having to decide, okay, who am I going to respond to out of the 5 people that just responded at the same time? So email is very inefficient. The issue is, even though these tools are more efficient, and the internet itself, I could argue, should be or could be a more efficient means of communicating, it's not. It's not for us. It has its own series of drawbacks. In looking at this type of thing in the workplace, I feel like it gives me some insight for society as a whole and the internet. But there are some differences, right? Enforcing rules on society is more and more difficult every year, I feel like, and that may not be a bad thing. And, when it comes to these tools, I'm not convinced that we as humans have the capability to be able to do this effectively. If we do, I would say that it's definitely not today, and it's going to take us, a long time, probably hundreds of years to get better at this. Honestly, if there's anybody from the far future watching this video today, which I highly doubt, hey, just know that people struggled with this stuff back in the day, Now, I don't want to just leave you with this terrible conundrum. What do I think we should do? I don't have, a fix-it-all solution. I really don't. But I can give you some pointers from my experience that can really help. Realize a lot of these are really hard to do. And it may not sound like some of them are, but wait until you're in the situation and you'll understand. So the biggest thing I struggle with, and I think one of the bigger things that you need to do in order to prevent these types of situations where we have huge miscommunications and people end up hating each other at the end of the day, even though they've just been sending, little tidbits of text to one another. Don't get defensive. That's easier said than done. That when you're online having a perfectly normal conversation, especially, if this is, part of your day, like, where I work, that's just what I do all day. Aside from writing software, I'm communicating, and that's how I'm communicating. So it can be quite jarring when someone accuses you of doing something bad, right? Or you may even perceive that they have, even if that's not really what they intended. And the most important thing is to not become defensive. And this can be, again, impossible, especially if you haven't had a lot of experience with these types of things. And even if you've had a lot of experience with people being upset with you on the internet, it's still really hard. And the reason why is because generally what happens with these situations is we have entered into these situations with different context. And what I found from dealing with these situations at work is that most of the time, if you were to stop right at that point, at the point where you feel like you're being accused, someone has said, hey, you did something bad, I don't like what you said, whatever. If you were to go talk to that person, you would completely understand and most likely empathize with their position, especially if you're open-minded. But it's impossible to do that when you're defensive, because when you're defensive, you're only worried about protecting yourself. And that's a natural reaction. That goes back to evolution, that becoming socially defensive it's not a bad thing to do, right? It's an understandable thing to do, that there are situations where you do need to be socially defensive. And unfortunately, the internet can kind of trigger that with us when it really shouldn't. And had the conversation happened in person, it wouldn't have happened. So all I found you can do is to try not to become defensive. For me, I use my personal experience where I have had situations where I was becoming defensive and instead decided to engage that person and speak to them in as normal a way as possible. And when I say normal, I mean if in person or on a Zoom call or at least on a phone call, somewhere where we can speak and hear each other's tone. And if we do that early enough and we have not become so entrenched and so defensive that we just can't do anything but argue with one another, things tend to go pretty well. In fact, I had an experience, this week where I'm so glad that my reaction was to stop and talk in real life, or as close as we can get to real life. Now, you can't always do that on the internet. In fact, I'd argue you almost never can, right? Because, are you really going to call this person, in the middle of the night when you're arguing back and forth? No, you're not going to do that. And the next best thing, in my opinion, is to kind of modify one of the rules of the internet. And, there is a rule of the internet that says never take anything seriously. Now, in certain settings, you can't just never take anything seriously, but what you can do is always attempt to take the least serious interpretation. And that is what I recommend, that when you're reading text that someone else wrote, it's, you're in a difficult situation because you want to understand what they say accurately, but you're reading the text that they wrote and you're kind of tasked with interpreting their intent. And especially if you become defensive, you're going to be tempted to interpret it poorly. And so what you can do to kind of combat that is attempt to interpret it in the least serious way possible. Now, this could backfire, right? If they truly are being serious, this will only take you so far. But what it can do, especially if no fire has been lit, no spark has ignited anything yet, it can prevent the spark from igniting in the first place. That the most likely explanation is that this person does not have malintent. Our world is not filled with Disney villains. Generally, we all at least believe that we're justified in the actions we're taking or the words that we're saying. And yeah, maybe we've done some mental gymnastics to get there. Maybe we're rationalizing. That happens all the time. But I think intention for us as humans is very important to keep, tabs on. That I may end up thinking within an online conversation that something someone said, they said with bad intention. And this can be due to a lot of factors. It could just be that I'm having a bad day and other people that I've conversed with have been harsh with me. And so I just generally assume that you must be doing the same thing. I didn't like what I read, and I'm just going to assume that the reason I didn't like it is because you're being a jerk to me just like everybody else. And that's where problems start. Because when you write things on the internet, you never know what state of mind people will be in when they sit down to read them. And one thing I want you to think about is how bad of a day that person may have had. They may have lost their job. And, I don't know if anyone's ever gone through that that's watching this video, but it can completely wreck your self-esteem. It can break you as a person. It can destroy your identity, and it can be a very difficult thing to go through. They could have, one of their parents may be in the hospital and they just learned that they have about a week left with them. And they may be struggling with the fact that their parent is incoherent and they feel like, that they've lost them. So I know these are sort of overly emotional situations, but they're things that I think are worth thinking about. That whenever you're communicating with anyone, and this spans far further than the internet, you do have to realize that they may be in a state of mind that maybe you've been in before too, and it's hard to know how they're going to react considering the different states of mind we can be in. And some of the ones I've listed are, I think, just extreme examples, but they're pertinent because these are things that happen to us. And, beyond that, beyond the way they could be interpreted, because, listen, I'm not saying there's anything you can do from that perspective, that there's no way you can predict the state of mind someone's going to be in when they sit down and read what you wrote. But you can better respond to their reaction. Let's say you wrote something and they come back at you sharply, right? They get upset with you over what you've said, even though, you may look at what you said and said, I don't know, why in the world this would upset anyone. The thing to realize there is, hey, this person may have just had a really, really bad day. This person may be going through something that I myself have experienced and never want to go through again. And so that's where, if you can think of it that way, right, that will motivate you to have a better mindset. And, when they respond in a defensive manner, you can attempt to keep a calm tone instead of also becoming defensive. Because once you're both defensive, things are not going to go well, generally. Unless you find some way to both take a break and come back later. Once you're both defensive like that, things are going to go downhill fast. And so, think about those things when that person says the thing that makes you, defensive, especially if, you are the person talking and they got mad at you for something you said. That this needs to be taken as an opportunity to directly engage this person. Because, in general, if you are on the internet and you're writing something and it, turns into kind of an argument, you generally, at least I generally, a lot of us generally, tend to just go with the argument in whatever form we have. And there is a point, and it's an early point in my opinion, where, especially if you value your relationship with this person at all, but even if you don't, you're much better off engaging them directly. Don't turn this into the Russian or the Roman Colosseum. Don't. That's the thing, is that I think that when these things happen, we have a tendency to see it as a battle royale. That this is now a public, a public demonstration of your combat abilities. And on the internet, a lot of times, it even goes down to, I want to prove that I'm right and this person is wrong to the world, right? I'm on the internet, I'm in the world, I want to prove that I'm right. And unfortunately, that tendency is incredibly destructive. The problem is that the tendency we need to have is what I just said. We need to take this, at work we call it take it offline, right? We need to directly engage this person and speak with them. And hey, I get that, maybe even most of us are not going to be motivated to do that. But I'm hoping that if we have enough bad experiences like this, we'll start to learn. All right, guys, so hey, I hope you like this video. Please post your thoughts below. If you did like it, please give me a like. Have a good night.